Well, hello. We're passing out problem sets, and if you didn't get one, there's a pile here you can pick up after lecture. The answers to the first problem set I've now posted on the course website, so you can look at the answers if you want. Also, your GSIs will either be going over them in section or not. Each GSI is deciding for themselves whether they think that's a useful use of time. So it might depend on how well you did when you turned them in and what they thought. So, ask your GSI whether they'll be going over them or not. But they're on the website. Okay, today what I want to talk about is a variety of issues that were raised in last lecture, but we kind of skirted over because I wanted to get the whole concept of competition out. There's a lot of subtleties to this and a lot of new issues that are arising that I want to discuss, and that's what today's lecture is about. Okay, so first of all, the main value of competition, the reason we like it so much, whose phone's going off? I used to mind when people's phones would go off. Did I ever tell you all this? Their cell phones would go off in class, and now it doesn't really bother me at all. I had an audience with the Pope once, and someone's cell phone went off in front of the Pope, and the person took the call. It was like, hold that thought, Your Holiness. I figured if they could do it with the Pope, they could certainly do it with me. Anyway, so I'm very lax about it now. Okay, competition and efficiency. The main reason we like competition, it brings us to what we consider social optimality. And the reason is, I want to describe this quickly and then go into some aspects of it. Each firm increases its output until the marginal cost of its last unit is equal to the price. It does so because every unit it can make extra profit by doing that. And then when marginal cost is equal to price, it doesn't continue producing any more because then it's not worth it. Okay? No extra profit. Consumers continue buying until their marginal willingness to pay drops to the price. They buy whenever marginal willingness to pay is over price and continue until it equals price. And so that means marginal willingness to pay, which is the benefit to the consumer as defined by the consumer, him or herself, is equal to the cost of the good. And that's social optimality. Okay? So this is the main reason we like competition. Now, remember last lecture I said that everyone has the same marginal willingness to pay in a market where you're facing a price. It's because each of us continue consuming until our marginal willingness to pay is equal to the price. This must have felt a little bit unreal to each of you. It would be quite unlikely that we have exactly the same marginal willingness to pay. This is an example of how theory simplifies things in a way that helps you look at reality, but you should not allow the simplifications to make you think that it's not real. It's still real. The reason everyone doesn't have exactly the same marginal willingness to pay is because we actually can't consume fractional quantities of goods. What we've done in our analysis, in our simplification, is assume there's a marginal willingness to pay curve that's a continuous line, which is our demand curve, and you can buy any fraction you want of the good. If that were true, we would all end up with exactly the same marginal willingness to pay. But in reality, we only buy quantities, integers, like especially for some items, you don't buy even very many of them, like a car. You might buy one car or two cars, maybe three, but you don't really have a demand curve that's continuous. You can't buy 1.5 cars or 1 3/4 cars. So what that means is that your demand curve is actually individual points. One car, your willingness to pay for that. 2 cars, your willingness to pay for the second car, given that you've got one. 3 cars, and there's a big jump in between each one of them. Maybe. Could be a big jump. Nevertheless, even though we have simplified that away because it helps us do the analysis on graphs and allows us to see the forces at work, you want to go back to that reality and see what still applies. And hopefully now you'll be able to see that reality better than you were before. And it turns out that we still get the optimal solution. So the optimality result here is not at all conditional on the idea that we've simplified in that particular way. And the reason should be clear at this point. suppose you have a good that this is their price, this is your willingness to pay for the last unit you bought, okay, and it's above the price or you wouldn't have bought it, and your willingness to pay for the next unit is below the price. You didn't buy it. That's why it's below the price. If it had been above the price, you would have bought it. So, for example, it could be that your willingness to pay for a car is $50,000 and you only have to pay $15,000 to get a car, so you bought your first car. Your second car you really don't need. You're only willing to pay $2,000 for it, and that's less than the price of a car, and so you didn't buy it. So there's a huge gap there. But you still get optimality. Think about it. The last unit that was sold, the amount the person was willing to pay is greater than the price, and or else they wouldn't have bought it. And the amount that it cost the producer to provide it was less than the price, less than or equal to the price, or they wouldn't have sold it. So for that last unit that was sold, marginal willingness to pay exceeds the cost of the good. And so from a social perspective, it's desirable that we produce that good, and it was indeed produced and sold. Now let's look at the next unit. For the next unit, the one that wasn't bought and sold, the marginal willingness to pay for that one is less than the price, or else the person would have already bought it. That's why they didn't buy an extra good. And the marginal cost of it is greater than the price, or else the provider would have already sold it. Okay? So for the next good, the marginal willingness to pay, which is the benefit, is below price, and the cost is above price, and it's not desirable to produce that. The cost exceeds the benefit, and from a social perspective, we should not provide it. So even though we don't have this nice, smooth optimality where everyone's marginal willingness to pay is exactly the same and equal to price, you still end up, as soon as you've seen it this way and go through the analysis, you can go back to the more real situation and see that the optimality still occurs. And that is the value of theory. That's what a lot of people dismiss theory because they think that it simplifies the real world and doesn't represent the real world. The reality of it is that good theory simplifies the real world and represents it better than you could see without the simplification. And that's what you're hoping to try to get from the theory. Okay, so you get optimality in this market. It's astonishing. It's that break point of price. People consume until whenever their marginal willingness to pay is greater than price. Suppliers supply as long as their marginal cost is below the price. So you always end up at optimality. Now, competition brings about other outcomes that you can consider beneficial or not, depending on your perspective. Many people do. One is that profits end up being zero. In stage 2 equilibrium, firms enter and leave the industry until profits end up being at zero. Now, one thing I didn't mention last lecture, but hopefully you remembered from the lecture on cost, when Zhao Yu was presenting what total cost is. Total cost includes a return to the entrepreneurs for their capital and time. So zero profit doesn't mean that the entrepreneur's not making anything. It means that they're making a normal return to their own investment of time and money. Essentially, the costs of the firm, the things that are included in our total cost curve, marginal cost curve, and average cost curve, are the remuneration for all inputs that are used in production. So the firm pays for the land, pays rent for capital, pays laborers, pays whatever needs to be paid, and the entrepreneur's inputs are used also, and so those get remunerated. The entrepreneur's capital gets a return on capital, and the entrepreneur's time gets a return on time on that. So that is included. And from an accounting perspective, if you're doing an accounting, if you're the entrepreneur and doing an accounting sheet for your firm, that is positive profits that you use to pay yourself with. Okay? So from an accounting perspective, you have positive profits. But in the way we're defining costs and profits, there are zero profits because they're already included in cost. That's a more consistent way to treat costs from a social perspective. You pay every input its required remuneration. And what zero profit means is that this is the least remuneration that's necessary for the firms to stay in business. If you paid them less money than this, if the entrepreneurs received less return on their capital or labor, then they would leave the market. and then the price would rise, and there'd be more revenue generated at a higher price for the remaining ones. So in a sense, we don't even need to be able to account, or from a, this is another value of theory, we don't even have to be able to measure what is the required remuneration to the entrepreneurs. It is revealed in the market. Whatever remuneration prevents firms from leaving and no new firms entering is the minimum required remuneration for the entrepreneurship. It's kind of definitional. And we know that a competitive industry will eventually move to that point where the minimum necessary remuneration is given to the entrepreneurs. Now, this can be considered desirable or undesirable depending on your perspective. Most of us think of ourselves as consumers more than producers, though actually we're all both. And so many people think the idea of not having any profits that the firm makes is good, because it means that there's no transfer of money from consumers to producers. All that's transferred to them is the minimum necessary to produce the good. However, there is an alternative perspective on this that you could take. And so this idea of zero profits being desirable need not be your own perspective. You can look at this as the producers are the ones that are creating the value. They're the ones that have gone out there, created the firm, created the product that then provides value to the people who are buying it. Why shouldn't they get some extra money for that? Why do they have to get just the minimum necessary to keep them going? In a competitive system, consumers get the entire surplus. Consumer surplus is positive, producer surplus is zero. That's a very extreme solution. It means consumers get all the benefit that was created in making this good, and the producers who actually produce the good don't get anything. You could see it from the opposite perspective, that it should be that the producers, who are the ones who are creative force creating this good and putting it out there, should be getting the large amount of profit. But nevertheless, most people believe zero profit is a good idea. Next aspect of it is, since there's zero profit, that necessarily means that price is equal to average cost. That's, in a sense, another way of writing zero profit. This is desirable, has a social benefit, or can be considered to be equitable, because essentially what this means is that each person is paying their fair share of the cost. They're paying total cost of producing all the goods divided by the number of goods. Each person's paying their fair share. So there is no one's paying less than their fair share. Also, since we end up in equilibrium, firms entering and leaving until profits are eliminated and each firm prices at marginal cost, that means that we end up at price equal to the minimum of the average cost curve. This means that consumers are paying the absolute minimum that is technologically possible to pay for this good. You can simply not produce this good at a lower price and break even. So it's desirable in that sense. Two more things that we haven't actually discussed, or weren't explicit in the previous dump. One is there's no waste. Waste is when a firm uses an inefficient product mix or doesn't produce as much as possible given what they've got as inputs. They waste their time, their workers don't work efficiently or whatever. Why is there no waste in a competitive system? Huh? There's no surplus to waste from. That's basically it. You could think about it. Suppose you've got an equilibrium where all the firms are wasting and they're all making zero profit at their wasteful levels of output, production. If you were a smart entrepreneur, you would see, I can go into that market and make a profit. They're making zero profit with waste. I can go in without wasting and make a positive profit. What would happen? You would enter. Other entrepreneurs who are willing to be efficient would enter. The supply curve shifts out. The price drops. And all the firms that were wasting are now making negative profits. And either they get rid of their wasteful ways or they go out of business. So there can be no equilibrium when there's free entry and exit with waste. There will be smart entrepreneurs out there that will see this as a profit opportunity, will take advantage of it, and that will force the other ones to either revert to non-wasteful ways or go out of business. Amazing. Also, all new technologies will be adopted. If a new technology for production is introduced into the industry, we're going to talk later about how new technologies are developed. But for now, let's say somehow there's a new technology developed. All these new technologies will be introduced. Why? It's the same logic as for waste. If you have an industry that's at equilibrium without this technology, and the technology comes about, then a new entrepreneur will say, I can go in and make a profit in this industry because all of them are making zero profit without this new technology that reduces costs, say, and I can make a positive profit. So the new entrepreneur will come in with the technology, undercut or being able to make a positive profit while everyone else is making zero profit. Other entrepreneurs will do the same thing. That'll push out the supply curve, drop the price, and all the firms that are out there will either shift to the new technology, in which case their costs are lower, or they'll go out of business. So again, you get the same kind of effect. So it's just astonishing what happens because of lots of firms and homogeneous product and free entry and exit. So we should try to use these forces whenever we can. It's just amazing. Okay, no okays today. 3 important distinctions I want to make. I've described them here and we'll go over them step by step. I want to distinguish the firm's demand curve from the market demand and talk a little bit more about that and what the implications of that are. How to represent the supply curve in stage 2 in a different way than we've looked at before. And then the critical issue from a policy perspective, when is competition actually feasible? What should we do from a policy perspective to bring about competition when it's possible? And the first thing we have to know is, when is it possible? Now, demand for the market versus demand for the firm. You will remember this graph from last lecture. This is the equilibrium in stage 2. Got the demand curve for the product that we know that the price for the good is going to be in equilibrium at the minimum of the average cost curve. And so that means the quantity demanded in the market will be this amount, and the price will be here. And the demand curve for each individual firm will be a flat demand curve at that price. What do these demand curves mean? Someone actually asked me about this after lecture, and that's what I was wanting to describe today. These are 2 different concepts of demand. It can be confusing because it's both demand for the product, but they're actually 2 different concepts of demand. One way to look at the distinction is, this is the demand curve for the product as a whole. Say, in the example of my uncle's wheat farm, this is the demand for wheat. And that's downward sloping, as you would expect, because if the price of wheat rose, some people are going to keep buying it. This, however, is the demand curve for my uncle's wheat. Not wheat in general, a specific category within the wheat. And remember when we talked about demand curves and their slopes several lectures ago, the demand curve for a group of products will often be steeper than the elements within that. The demand curve for cars is maybe very steep. The demand curve for imports is less steep because people can shift from imports to domestic cars. This is an extreme version of this. This is the demand for wheat in general, and this is one particular type of wheat, element within that category, in which it's exactly like all the rest of it, and so nobody's going to buy if the price rises for that. That's one way to think about it. The other way to think about it is, this is going to then lead into what my next point is. This is the demand for wheat if the price of wheat rises. If you're here and the price of wheat rises, how much are people going to quit buying? Another way to think about that is that it's the demand for wheat when all wheat producers raise their price together. Now, they might not have the ability to do so, but you can still ask the hypothetical question. If all wheat producers raise their price together, so the price of wheat went up together, what would be the reduction in the total amount of wheat purchased? This is the demand for wheat for this firm given that it raises its price alone. Remember, we derived this under the idea of this is the market price. If my uncle tried to raise the price of his wheat, went out to take it to the silo and say, nope, I want 2 cents more per bushel, no one would buy from him. So this is that one farmer raising his price and everyone else keeping their price constant. So we have two concepts of price response now. This is the demand curve when all firms raise their price together. This is the demand curve when one firm raises its price alone. The important thing here is that the demand curve for an individual firm is flat whenever you have a homogeneous product, no matter how few firms there are. All you need is 2 firms. You don't need to have lots of firms like we've assumed here. All you need is 2 firms for the demand for one firm to be flat. Essentially, think about it, if you have 2 firms, and if the 2 firms raise their price together, they would still be able to sell some output because they're the only ones selling that. But if one of those firms raised its price and the other firm didn't, no one would buy from the higher priced firm if indeed the good was homogeneous. It's exactly the same product. So this critical flat demand curve, which gave us this social optimality, pricing at marginal cost, is actually not dependent on there being lots of firms. It's dependent on there being at least 2 firms and homogeneous product. The key element here, is homogeneous product. So you should be asking yourself, why do we even need lots of firms in a competitive market? Why is that considered practically the essence of competition? And the answer is the following. Suppose the firms colluded. Each firm knows if I raise my price by myself and it's a homogeneous product, I'm going to lose all my customers. But the firms all know also that if we raised all of our prices together, we wouldn't lose all of our customers. This is the market demand curve. Each firm realizes that if somehow we could all raise our prices together, this is the demand curve that each of us would face. It's the demand curve for the market divided by however many firms there are in the market. Now, if you were an entrepreneur, which demand curve would you rather face? This one or that one? You'd obviously rather face this one because here you can raise your price and end up here where you're pricing above your average cost of making a profit. At this point, you're making 0 profit. And if you changed your price and tried to raise your price to make more profit, you're simply going to go out of business because no one will buy from you. With this demand curve, however, you can raise your price and still keep some customers and make a positive profit. All firms would rather face this demand curve than this demand curve. What this tells us is that all firms would like to collude, to act in unison, rather than raise their price alone. They're all going to be better off doing that. And what prevents it? First of all, it's illegal. That's not necessarily a prevention because you need to prove, the government would need to prove that you colluded. And since all firms know that this is best for all of them, there's no reason to even have emails going back and forth agreeing to it. You just know that it's the best thing to do, and so everyone does it. So often you can have collusion among firms without there being any evidence of it. This brings us back now to the issue of why do we have lots of firms in a competitive industry? Recall that with only 2 firms, each firm would face a flat demand curve because of homogeneous product. But if you only had 2 firms, it is beyond a doubt that they would recognize that their interest is best served by moving their prices together. And they would not act as our competitive firms do. They would act in a collusive fashion. They don't even have to talk to each other. And both raise their prices together, both of them making a positive profit. They would realize their mutual interest in the situation and act in accordance with that. With lots of firms in the industry, it is essentially impossible to bring about a collusive understanding among all the firms. The reason is it would be very easy for any one firm, if all the firms in the industry, say there were 1,000 farmers or whatever in the industry, if they all raised their price together, every one firm would see, I can shave my price and get a lot more customers. It's just exceedingly difficult to maintain collusion when there's lots and lots of firms. So that is the purpose of there being lots of firms. This is important. People don't actually realize that the function of there being lots of firms in a competitive industry is not to bring about the flat demand curve and pricing at marginal cost because of that. The flat demand curve comes about whenever you have homogeneous products. And so you can actually use that in other industries where you don't have lots of firms if you think there's not going to be collusion. What the lots of firms does is make it essentially impossible to collude, so that the firms then use this demand curve rather than the collusive demand curve. This now brings us to a graph. All of theory, I think, is useful for pointing out, elucidating forces that operate in the world. And what we're wanting to do is say, we had those 4 conditions at the beginning for competition. What would be nice is to be able to see how each of them plays out. What contribution is each of those making to the results? Because sometimes you'll have some of the conditions and sometimes you won't have, you'll have other of the conditions. And so to see where the forces are operating is useful. And this graph describes it. If you have a homogeneous product, you're going to have flat demand as long as you have more than one firm. If you've got 2 firms, it doesn't matter. You've got a flat demand curve for each individual firm. If it raised its price alone, then it would get no customers. What many firms does is give us the fact that the firms don't collude, and hence they use this flat demand curve for their decision making, rather than using the market demand curve divided by the number of firms, which is what would happen with collusion. Homogeneous product gives us the existence of a flat demand curve, and many firms means that firms will actually use that demand curve. They won't collude. If you have a flat demand curve and it's used for decision making by the firms, the way they use it is to increase production until marginal cost is equal to the price. They'll increase production whenever marginal cost is below price, continuing until marginal cost rises to price. So this result here only relies on there being homogeneous product and many firms. You should be able to infer immediately from this that if you do not have a lot of firms, but something else is preventing the firms from colluding, then you still get this result. You could have maybe 2 or 3 firms, but if there's something in there that keeps them from colluding, I don't know what it would be, but it would, maybe they hate each other, then you would still have the benefits of competition in this regard. This result occurs just from these 2 assumptions. You don't need anything about free entry and exit. Free entry and exit, in a sense, has a life of its own that we have brought into the story, but also applies in other industries. Whenever there's free entry and exit, prices drop until profits are 0. This is practically the definition of free entry and exit. If there's profits in an industry, other entrepreneurs will see it and will decide to come in and make some profit of their own. If there's free entry and exit, that will always be an option, and firms will take advantage of it. So no matter what's happening on homogeneous products and how many firms there are in the market, free entry and exit by itself brings about 0 profit in equilibrium. It pushes prices down to 0, down to where profits are 0. And if profits are 0, then prices equal to average cost. Now we combine these 2. You can think of industries that have this going on, but not these 2, or one of these 2, but not all of them. and you get different results. But in competition, you get the amazing situation where you have price is equal to marginal cost because of non-colluding firms with a homogeneous product, and price is equal to average cost because of free entry. And what happens when price is equal to average cost and marginal cost? It means marginal cost is equal to average cost, because that's the only way it can happen, and that happens where? At the minimum of the average cost curve. The only place where marginal cost is equal to average cost is at the minimum of the average cost curve. So you end up getting this result as a result of both of these two occurring simultaneously. If price is equal to marginal cost and equal to average cost, that means marginal cost is equal to average cost, and we're at the minimum of the average cost curve. That's how all these results play through. And it's interesting now, this graph in itself should make intuitive, or this slide should make intuitive sense to you, but it took going through all those graphs last lecture for it to crystallize down to just this information. And this is the kind of stuff you want to remember when you're then going analyzing markets as a whole. Now, next topic. I defined what the supply curve was in stage 1 for the market. It's the sum of the marginal cost curves of the individual firms, sum over the number of firms that are in the industry. But you probably didn't notice, I never actually defined a supply curve in stage 2 for competitive industry. And that's what I'm going to do now. What I want to argue, and hopefully convince you, is that the supply curve in stage 2 in a competitive industry is flat at the minimum of the average cost curve. This is the supply curve in stage 1, which is the sum of the marginal cost curve over however many firms there are in the industry. Stage 1, you have a fixed number of firms, so you add this up by however many that is, 100 of them or whatever, and you get this. But in stage 2, the number of firms is not fixed. If there's profits being made, the number of firms increases. If there's losses being made, the number of firms decreases. And so the concept of adding up marginal cost over the number of firms doesn't make sense because there's not a number of firms. The number of firms varies. And in fact, it varies in a very particular way. If price is ever above the minimum of the average cost curve, then profits are being made, and there will be, if price is somehow maintained there, which is the definition of a supply curve, if price is a given level, what's going to be the supply? There's going to be more and more and more firms entering until eventually there's just going to be, more goods provided than you could possibly ever need. Any price above the minimum of the average cost curve will induce profits and hence will induce entry for as long as that price stays there. That means that the supply curve for any price above the minimum of the average cost curve is essentially infinitely large, way out here. For any price below the minimum of the average cost curve, firms are losing money, they'll all leave. So if price is somehow maintained below that, it won't maintain, but under the hypothetical of if price were below the minimum of the average cost curve, the number of firms in the industry would end up being 0, and you would have nothing provided. This flat supply curve essentially is the combination of those two. It's the 0, then kink over and get a very large quantity provided. It's kind of like the reverse of the flat demand curve. Another way to look at this is as you get more and more firms responding for a price above the average cost, there gets to be more and more firms entering, and so you get more and more, and it goes like this. For a price below the average cost, there's fewer and fewer firms, and that decreases, and so you just get it going until eventually it gets flat. We have two supply curves then. A supply curve for the industry for a fixed number of firms, which is by definition of fixed means we're in stage 1, and then a supply curve that's flat at the minimum of the average cost curve. That's the supply curve in stage 2 when the number of firms varies. This actually helps us analyze competitive situations in a much more succinct fashion than if we didn't utilize this supply curve, this market supply curve. For example, Suppose we want to see what is the impact of an increase in demand in the market. Our traditional way of doing it would be to have demand curve here. We draw an average cost curve. We know that the equilibrium in this initial situation is going to be price at the minimum of the average cost curve, each firm producing at that minimum of the average cost curve, and the quantity demanded in the market will be whatever's demanded at that given price. Now suppose we increase the demand curve. So now more people at every price are wanting to buy this good than were wanting to buy it before. Our analysis would say, in this two-graph situation, our new equilibrium, price is still at the minimum of the average cost curve. Each firm produces the same amount, but now with the higher demand curve, we have a higher quantity demanded. What has happened? If each firm's doing exactly the same thing as before and price is the same thing, the only thing that has happened is there's now more firms in the industry. And you can work this through as a stage 1 going to stage 2 analysis if you want to. A stage 1 supply curve would look like this, where you got a fixed number of firms, each firm with a marginal cost. As the demand increases, there gets to be a higher equilibrium price up here. That causes each firm to then make a profit, and those profits induce new entry until eventually the price is driven back down to here. So what happens is you have a short run or a stage 1 profit that the firms make, which induces new entry, and you end up exactly where you were before, same price, same quantity for each firm, with just more firms providing the good. This is the long explanation. This is the one that's the more complete explanation using the graphs we've described, and it's very good to go through this. But you could also do it in a simplified fashion, knowing that the supply curve is flat. Bingo, all those things I've said. By just using our standard demand and supply ideas. So knowing that the supply curve is flat, you could have gotten to this result immediately. You got a demand curve, flat supply curve. You just move from one equilibrium to the new equilibrium, and all that happens is the quantity that is demanded or quantity that is sold increases, and the supply responds as necessary to it. Knowing that the supply curve is flat allows you to use either of these two devices, the more detailed one or the more simple one. If demand increases, that's a good point. If you want to look at individual firms, the problem with this graph is it tells you what happens in the industry, but doesn't help you understand what happens with each firm. So you go back to this one. If the demand increases, each firm has a marginal cost curve, and you have a supply curve for a fixed number of firms. Essentially what happens is the equilibrium price in the market rises. Each firm moves up their marginal cost curve and starts making a profit. So the immediate effect is each firm increases output and makes profit. But then that profit induces new firms to enter, which then pushes the price back down to where it was. Each firm then retreats and goes back exactly where they were, and essentially no firm cares. And if you look at this, this is how it plays out in competitive markets. My uncle could care less about the world demand for wheat, because he knows it doesn't matter. It's all going to come out in the wash. He's going to be back to just farming his land the same as always. These things don't affect after the price effects play out. You can sometimes make money in the short run on the fluctuations in price, but eventually it goes back to where it was. Excise tax is another peculiar situation. Notice that the previous one is peculiar because usually an increase in demand will raise the price of the good. Here it doesn't. An excise tax. Remember we talked about how an excise tax is borne partly by consumers and partly by producers. Here we get an extreme situation where it's borne entirely by the consumers. If we have an excise tax placed on the good, this can be represented as an upward shift in the cost curve. When you're looking at it, taxes from an individual firm's point of view instead of the market, it's actually much easier to think about it. A tax on the good is essentially just another cost of production. You pay your workers, you pay your landlord, you pay your interest on your mortgages and stuff, and you pay the government. You pay the government the amount of tax. So it becomes another form of cost. And all it does is raise the average cost curve up by the amount of tax for an excise tax, which is a per unit tax. It also raises the marginal cost curve up because each unit costs more. So if you wanted to draw the marginal cost curve, the original marginal cost goes through the minimum of this average cost, and then that marginal cost curve shifts up by the amount of tax, and the new one now goes through the minimum of the new average cost curve. What this means, though, is that the price in the market will rise by the full amount of the tax. All that happens is the new equilibrium is at the minimum of the new average cost curve, which is simply the old average cost curve plus the tax. So the equilibrium price rises by the full amount of tax. This is actually a way to see whether a market is competitive. If you can't use information about the number of firms and other things, you can see what is the impact of changes in costs, or in this case tax, on a market. And if the full tax is passed through to consumers, if eventually the price rises by the full amount of tax, then that shows you're in a competitive market. You can also show this more readily by using the supply curve, flat supply curve idea. And our old ideas of how to handle it, a excise tax. Get a demand curve, your original supply curve. If you have an excise tax, you can represent that as an increase in the supply curve by the amount of tax. And as you'll see, that happens to be this. And the consumer's burden is this amount. The producer's burden is 0. There's no reduction in the amount the producer is getting. They're getting exactly, the consumer's paying, if the tax is, say, 50 cents, paying 50 cents more than before. The government gets 50 cents of it, and so the firm ends up getting the same price they were before. So the firm isn't hurt by this at all. There's no burden. Some of you might think that this is unfair. Why is it that the consumer has to pay all the tax and not the producer in this situation? What's the answer? What? That's part of it, marginal willingness to pay. In a sense, it's kind of like the consumer is less responsive. Let me get back to that answer because it's a little more subtle than it sounds. The real reason is producers don't have anything to pay with. They're making 0 profit. If they had to incur any burden, they would simply leave the industry. And so because of that, the only surplus to be tapped is on the consumer side. This is kind of the flip of the idea we were giving before, that profits are 0, which means consumers get all the benefits of production, all the surplus that's produced in the market. That means that if anyone's going to have to give up some surplus, it has to be the consumers. They're the only ones getting any. So this is not necessarily unfair because, in a sense, the firms aren't making any profit otherwise. The other way to look at it is what was being described here. Remember, I said earlier, who pays for a tax essentially comes down to who is less responsive, who is less able to respond to the tax. And in this situation, in a competitive market, firms are making 0 profit. If anything incurs a cost on them, such that they would then make negative profits, which is defined as not enough remuneration to keep them deciding to go in business, they just leave. Free entry and exit. They respond completely by leaving and going into some other industry or doing something else with their time and money. So the suppliers in this case are, in a sense, infinitely responsive. They, as soon as they start losing money, get out. So the demanders, the buyers, if you raise the price, they still want to buy some of it because they're getting surplus from it. They might give up some of the consumption, but they still want to buy some of it. So they're not able to respond as much as the suppliers do. Running low on time here. Now, when should we promote competition? We as a government, we as a society have produced laws, we're going to discuss these later in the course, that try to promote competition and prevent the growth of monopoly power in various ways. Our theory of competition should make it clear to us when do we actually need to put vigilance into assuring competition, and when do we not need to, and in fact, when is it going to be counterproductive? So that's what I want to talk about now. There are times in which you don't need to do anything. The competitive system is going to work on its own. It can't fail. There's going to be times when no matter what you want to do, you can't get competition. Don't try. And then there's going to be a set of situations where those are the ones you want to intervene on. So that's the distinction here. Go back to our graph here of the firm and the market. Remember that this is the quantity produced by the firm. This is the quantity in the market. I want to combine these two. This is quantity here. It's just that this is in much bigger units. So I want to put one graph that has both the individual firm's information and the market information. That means this quantity axis is going to have to be very long. That's what this graph is. Essentially, I have made one graph with the firm's information, and then the quantity axis just goes on really far, and this is like an accordion. I've squashed it in right here just so I can get it here. Otherwise, it'd be sticking out over there on that side of the room. Okay, but putting it on one graph allows you to visually see what happens in different types of situations and when is competition feasible. This is a situation in which competition is feasible and, in a sense, self-enforcing. Suppose the minimum of the average cost curve is a small quantity compared to market demand. In this situation, equilibrium would provide us with, again, you take the minimum quantity, where minimum of average cost, divide that into the amount demanded in the market. That gives you the number of firms. So it's just this amount plus that, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 firms. 10 is probably enough to prevent collusion, and so you would have competition. This is a market in which competition can occur, and it would occur. Notice that the government doesn't even have to do anything. Suppose one firm tried to expand its output to take over the market. Suppose one firm wanted to monopolize this market and try to do something to get rid of its competitors. The only way it can expand its output is by moving up the average cost curve. So by moving up the average cost curve, it would actually be losing money. A firm that tries to take over the market would end up going out of business because it would lose money. It would be pricing, the market price would be below its average cost. So when the firm increases its production, it wouldn't be able to undercut its competitors. It would actually be at a competitive disadvantage and would either retreat back or would go out of business. So you don't need to do anything here. Firms that try to take over the market will immediately fail and have to go back. So the government in this situation doesn't need to try to prevent the growth of monopoly power. It's a self-enforcing mechanism. That's another beauty of this. If the average cost curves are right, it just happens all on its own. What's a situation in which monopoly profits cannot occur? I'm sorry, where competition cannot occur? I've done exactly the same graph, but instead I've drawn the average cost curve to where the minimum of it is a very large share of market output. If you tried to have competition, suppose we somehow got to the minimum of the average cost curve, how many firms are there going to be here? There's just going to be 2. 1 plus 2, that looks like about half. And if you have 2 firms, what are they going to do? They're not going to take each other's prices given. They're going to collude. And you won't have competition. Not only that, it doesn't matter what the government does, you're not going to be able to enforce competition. If the government took these 2 firms and broke them up, remember Standard Oil was broken up? That was a case they should have been broken up. But the government often in antitrust cases will take a large firm and break it up and, in a sense, force competition on the market, force there to be lots of firms. But if the average cost curve looks like this, you take this one firm, break it into 10 pieces, each one of them will be having an average cost that's exceedingly high. What's going to happen then? Any firm that happens to by chance, get a little bit extra sales than the other one, will have a lower average cost, will be able to undercut the other ones. That will help them to gain market share even further. They'll be able to undercut even further, and they'll essentially ride down here until they're back where they were with a low average cost. And then you'll be back with just two firms colluding, implicitly colluding. So in this case, the government couldn't bring about competition. You simply can't have competition here. You could have competition if you could somehow keep the firms from, you could have the benefits of competition if you could keep the firms from colluding, but that's exceedingly difficult because collusion need not have any evidence associated with it. Hang on, I know we're going a little over, and I apologize. This is the situation in which you do want government intervention. Suppose you've got an average cost curve that goes down quickly, and then you've got a very long area before it starts rising again. You can produce a very small amount of output, or you can produce a very large amount of output, and the cost on average doesn't really change that much. Eventually, the average cost curve will start shooting up because eventually something will become restricted, but it might be out here. In this situation, you could have competition if somehow all the firms were out here, or you would have only two firms with collusion if they were here. This is a situation in which the government can and should try to prevent the growth of firms beyond the minimum of the minimum average cost. We want to have lots of little firms instead of two large firms. Either of them is feasible technologically within the market, and we need government intervention to make sure that this occurs rather than that one. Okay? Thank you. See you Monday.